This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Shelby County's top public defender and the head of local corrections, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by two people in the local court and law enforcement system. Thank you for being here. James Coleman is director of Shelby County Division of Corrections. Thanks for being here. Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. And Stephen Bush is chief public defender for Shelby County. Thank you both for being here. This is in part a continuation of last week's show. Last week we were able to have Amy Wyrick and Ed Stanton, the two prosecutors on the federal and local level. We wanted to continue that conversation, in part triggered by changes that came down from the federal government that Eric Holder, the Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General, about changes of the way the federal system is going to work. Now, neither of you deal directly with the federal laws, but I think there's at least an indirect impact. And that can just be a trigger for talking about the state of the court system, the jail system, and so on. So I'm going to start with you. I'll summarize in layman's terms. The U.S. Attorney General said we're going to change things. We're going to stop, putting so many people in jail for minor offenses. We talked last week about how Shelby County, both on the federal level and in the local state level, has really gone in that direction already. A lot more diversion, a lot more treatment, a lot more trying to deal with the problem, not in a one-size-fits-all way of just throwing people in jail, but in a multitude of ways. Do you see that as public defender, and do you welcome that shift?
Sure. It's good to address the core issues that are bringing people in contact with the justice system, and Shelby County has been and trying to work on those things for some time now. The significance of the Attorney General's remarks, though, are much broader than the efforts that have been on the ground here locally. A lot of that work that's been done here has also been initiated in other places, but what the Attorney General was talking about signals a significant shift in policy and attention to some very large issues affecting the country.
And I've heard some people say, I think Bill and I may have talked about this, that in some states, some areas, as the federal government says, look, we're not going to lock away everybody anymore, local government has maybe stepped in and said, well, we are. If you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. Do you see that kind of reaction happening here? We didn't hear that last week from the local prosecutor, Amy Wyrick, but is it your take that there'll be an overcompensation on the part of Shelby County or the state as a result of the federal government changing?
I don't think there'll be an overcompensation. I think the question is whether or not this shift in national attention to the problems of mass incarceration and the unsustainable burden of what's hit our prison system, not just nationally but in Tennessee, will begin to affect policy and practice in the local criminal justice systems.
Yeah.
I think that's yet to be seen.
Yeah. James Coleman, I'll bring you in. You were at 201 Poplar, the jail downtown, as people think of it, for some 12 years, I think, or 9 years.
About 9 years.
9 years. You're now at the correction center known, as you said, the penal farm is what everyone thinks of it as.
Yes.
This whole wave of incarceration, I mean, the numbers are really dramatic. Just the federal numbers I have, and I know your folks aren't federal, but just for perspective, that from 1980 to today, the federal prison population went from 24,000 to 220,000. And I think similar growth in terms of state level, local level prisons. Do you welcome these changes, this emphasis on diversion, this emphasis on treatment, this emphasis on things other than just throwing people in jail and for however long? Do you welcome that? Do you see a need for that?
Alternatives to incarceration are welcome. When you think about the purpose of the prison, we're looking to get a person in, hopefully to offer him or her services that will help them be better when they leave. Now, if bringing a person in, once they leave, they're really in worse shape, there's a problem. And here's what I mean by that. You take a 18-year-old that may have been on the street smoking a joint, and under the mandatory minimum, if we use that term, because he had drugs there's a determinate sentence he's going to have to serve. Is that the person that should go in and now have a felony conviction that follows him the rest of his life? Or should there be a program for that first offender, or whatever the case may be, that will accomplish the same goals? This is not what you should do. This is not what society wants you to do. But he can still go forward with his life. So I welcome that. I've seen a lot of young men that are now labeled as felons, and that prevents them from doing a lot of things that they should have been able to do.
Right, certain jobs you can't do, certain you can't apply, and so on. But also there's the experience specific to your role, that 18-year-old example who's had the one mistake and goes into the prison system. I mean, some people would say that that's basically almost separate from the label felon on their record. It's also a bit of a training ground. I mean, it's a rough place to be, I think, in the best prison. And so isn't you're exposing them to a whole lot of people that you aren't good peers, I would assume. I mean, is that your perspective?
The exposure is correct. They'll meet some people that they may not have otherwise met. They'll see some things, or maybe even learn some things that they would not have been normally exposed to. So it can have some bad consequences. On the other hand, they'll meet some people that will help and will encourage them. This is not the road you want to be on for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I saw you nodding.
But it's just the research is quite clear, and it has been for a long time, that once you hit the criminal justice system, jail, prison, incarceration, that the outcomes get very bleak on the back end of that. That the prison system is probably the worst place to engage people that are struggling with other life issues. Mm-hmm. And while it's admirable and good that the justice system creates programs and aspires to rehabilitate and to address whatever the life issues are that are going on within that individuals, it may be the worst place to try to tackle that problem. And I think that's one of the things that General Holder's statement, his shift in policy is doing, is putting a spotlight that the justice system is really designed to do two things. One, to make sure that before the government takes someone's liberty, that everyone gets a fair shake. Mm-hmm. But once someone's convicted, to make sure that they are punished for criminal behavior in a way that's thoughtful and even-keeled. Beyond that, what we do to support reentry and diversion and everything, we're doing it probably at the least effective, worst juncture throughout community systems. And I think what General Holder was saying was that we have to be looking at how the things that bring people in contact with the criminal justice system are driven by poverty and by trauma and by lack of education and all of these other deep, complex issues, and see what we can do to put the spotlight on those systems as a way to keep people from coming into the justice system to begin with.
Bill.
So at this point, when you or your staff are in court talking with the judge, talking with a prosecutor about defendant A, and you're looking at other options other than jail time for that defendant, is there an adequate infrastructure out there at the present time? Are there enough meaningful alternatives to jail time for that defendant?
Oh, heavens no. I mean, there will always be a need to bolster the supports within the community that can support interventions at key engagement points across the spectrum, at the school level, at the juvenile justice level, at the point of booking, at the time of sentencing, and at reentry. And what we need to be doing is reaching deep within the community to make sure that we are brokering access to supports and services that we can then begin to not just build targeted interventions, but to build a system of access at all of these key engagement points. Mm-hmm. So people like to talk about courts or programs or reentry, but it's all different points of engagement across the spectrum of what we need to be doing to stem the flow of people into the justice system.
Okay. You were nodding.
Well, the community needs to have more programs available to people. And here's what I mean by that. We have a wonderful parenting program in the institution, but how many parenting programs are offered to the community? If we have parenting programs at the local church, just as a for instance, a person getting out of prison could then continue that education once he leaves prison and not go into that class classroom as an ex-inmate, but as a parent needing help. I once heard an example when a child is 16 years old and he's going down the street and his mother's standing on the porch and she's calling his name, James, James, and James stands about 6'2", and he comes home to a 5'10" mother or a 5'5" mother. And he tells her, he said, look, I don't want you doing that anymore. I don't want you calling my name. I don't want you dissing me in front of my friends. Who does she call for help? Mm-hmm. But now when James doesn't come home and he's on the street corner with some guys and they get arrested, he's in jail, he's going through a system now which could give him some time inside of a correctional institution. Who does she call then? So that first part, that mother needs help before James is arrested.
Yeah, yeah.
On this program last week, General Wyrick also talked about the drug rehab program that you have at the Correction Center, which is a top-notch program. The problem, she said, is that often, as I understand it, there's a waiting list to get into it, and for some of the prisoners, some of those who have been convicted, they may be out by the time or before they could enroll in that program. It seems as if some of the programs in your institution are at least partially the answer outside of the walls of the institution as well. So is the answer here to adapt some of those programs outside of prison? Do prisons become different institutions in this transformation?
I think they do. Our whole purpose when an individual comes into our doors is to get him out. Now, what we want to do is to turn a better person back into society, but that means we've got to have those societal supports when they get out as well. So we can prepare and we can take them to a handoff level. We see the same thing with mental health. I mean, it's almost as if we have decided that once they walk out of our gates, they're fixed, and they're not.
Let's talk about that, because the key to reentry, to making it work, is to overcome the obstacles to ongoing supports. If we're going to talk about substance use, recovery from that disorder depends on high quality treatment and supports. Right. But when it works because of the relationships that are wrapped around it to make it work. And that's something that requires complexity and a deep reach into the community that, however well you may be doing within a structured environment in a set program, unless it's linked to ongoing supports and services in the community that are tailored to the needs of that individual, supported by the relationships that support that individual, the recovery, the outcomes aren't so good. Recovery is a non-linear process. There are ups and downs, and it just doesn't end at the back door of the correction facility. In fact, what happens in reality is the lifetime consequences that go with that conviction are what drive the recidivism cycle.
Well, we've been talking, and we've referenced the Attorney General remarks, and I'm thinking that there's probably a certain number of people out there who didn't hear those remarks and didn't hear that the context was very much about lower level offenses. So let's shift gears a little bit and say, what about the worst of the worst in terms of offenses? The murder, rape, armed robbery, whatever those most violent things you can think of. I don't think the Attorney General was really talking about them. That those are the people we want to be, take a different approach to. But what's your take on that? I mean, your office defends not just the guy who got, the street corner has a joint example, but also the person accused of murdering multiple people. Sure. Is there a new approach that needs to be taken for those really violent people also?
Yeah, I think part of what General Holder was saying was that prosecutors have a lot of discretion in terms of how they allocate their resources and what they prioritize. And frankly, I was a citizen for a long time before I became a defense lawyer. I'm a parent of young children, and I want to live in a safe community. And I don't think anyone would be opposed to the idea that once everyone gets a fair shake when they're being prosecuted, that punishment, that's a valid part of the system, and that should be directed to the people who pose serious risks, serious safety risks to other members of this community. So if you're convicted of those serious offenses, I don't think anyone is opposed to firm and swift punishment.
Yeah. And do you make that distinction too?
Absolutely. And I think from a resource standpoint, I'd rather see my resources spent in Stephen's office on that individual, making sure that that individual got a good shake everything was done, you know, whether he's convicted or found innocent, but I know he's been given the right representation, as opposed to spending those same dollars, you know, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of money devoted to defending anybody, to making sure that they get a fair shake. So I've got an 18-year-old that I'm going to spend, and Stephen knows the number much better than I would, say $50,000.
For a low-level offense.
For a low-level offense.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
as he said, the attorney has the discretion on where that money is going to be spent, and it's done, I think, appropriately. So I think.
Do you hear? I talked about this with the prosecutors, and you know, so Amy Weirich, and I don't even want to pick on her, but that is an elected position. Mm-hmm. You're appointed, right? You're not. Yeah. And Ed Stanton is a semi-political position, the U.S. Attorney for the area. And we talked a little bit about this, the political notion of being soft on crime. You know, no one wants to hear that. You know, crime is a big issue in this area. It's a big issue in any city. Do you bristle at that notion that any of this stuff means that you're going to be soft on crime?
I don't think any of these thoughtful, data-driven strategies to get more bang out of criminal justice funding are soft on crime. I do think that the General Holder's shift and move here took some courage to be able to stand up and say that we need to be thoughtful and serious about how we use what we have right now. The explosion in the American criminal justice system over the last 40 years is unprecedented anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. We incarcerate 25% of the people who are incarcerated throughout the world, even though we only have 5% of the world's population. No one's even close to what we've done. And what General Holder was saying was that we're getting a lousy return on that investment. It's not sustainable, and we need to rethink.
Yeah.
Director, you brought up something about the economic impact of using the criminal justice system as a blunt tool. What I think is going to come out of the Attorney General's shift is to look more deeply at the economic impact on communities like Memphis when we don't do everything we can do to stop the trajectory of a child, a young adult, into the adult criminal justice system. It's not what you pay for public defense that's so expensive. It's not what you pay to house someone, even though that's an extraordinary amount of money on the front end. It's ultimately the economic impact on that individual and their future, and perhaps for the community, even more importantly, economic impact on Memphis going forward.
Not the costs associated, again, but basically their lack of productivity almost, to put it in some callous way.
Once you hit the criminal justice system, and once you get that first, it's certainly not insignificant to the person who's getting the conviction, but the first misdemeanor conviction has a dramatic lifetime consequence in terms of your ability to get work.
I got you.
You can't find a job right now.
And getting loans and getting
without a criminal conviction.
Housing.
And in this economic environment, it has everything to do with everything going forward.
I got you. Okay, Bill.
Well, to that end, one of the things that we're trying to do with our reentry program, and I think the city started off with, the county is doing it as well, it's called Ban the Box. You know, if I go to an employer and the first thing that they see on the application I've checked, felon, then we all know the reality is that file goes into a 13.
Yeah.
You know, it's trashed. If we can ban that box and allow you to get to know me, because maybe while incarcerated, I've had the opportunity to learn forklift, because we have a program that teaches individuals forklift operations at the Correction Center. Maybe I've gone through anger management and I'm controlling that anger now. I've completed my GED. We're on pace, I think, this year to do about 120 graduations in GED. And I've done all of that. So I've actually made some good efforts to turn my life around. And you get to meet me as a person, and then we talk about the incarceration. I've got a little better chance. But so we're trying to do some things to not to get on an even field, but to at least get me on the playing field.
Gotcha.
Given the sheer volume of people that we see in the court system every day, does that limit the ability to maneuver toward alternatives for nonviolent offenders once they're convicted or once they plead guilty? Because I think most of the people who go through the court system at some point, there's going to be a point where they plead guilty, given the volumes that we deal with.
Well, the volume that's coming through the system is incredible, and it creates all sorts of problems throughout. We should look thoughtfully at the legislative level at what we can do. We could lop 20% to a third of the volume off the low end of the criminal justice system if we could find something other to do with people who have driving offenses, other than to arrest, charge them, and bring them into the system. That would reduce a significant amount of demand on your public defender system so that we could do a higher grade of work for people in terms of navigating them to creative and thoughtful and effective alternatives to incarceration.
And I assume you're not when you say you're not talking about a hit and run or some disaster.
No.
You're talking about somebody who's
driving while your license is suspended and revoked
Yeah.
because you didn't pay
Right.
a speeding ticket a while back.
So is that where have other states set up like separate
Sure.
administrative
And
mechanisms for that kind
a
of
lot of
thing?
conservative states are taking this opinion. These are not liberal or conservative ideas. These are
Yeah.
thoughtful approaches to being able to reallocate scarce government dollars to things that we
Right.
can get more value from. Our education systems, our public health systems, and to stop spending it on criminalizing every
Right.
behavior.
Yeah.
It's not that it's good to drive without a license. You should have a license, you should have insurance and all those other things, but is that how we want to spend our valuable criminal
Right.
justice
That the
dollars?
same judge deals with that, who needs to then deal with an armed robbery or a murder or these more serious things, or
And the
gang
volume
violence or something.
is staggering.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the impact it has on the economic well-being of our community. If you can't drive in Memphis,
Right. Because
Can't get a job.
you can't get a
talk
job.
about volume. We got about 5 minutes left. How many public defenders are there in your office, give or take?
I have 78 public defenders.
And how many on a typical day? Like, give us some sense of
Oh
volume.
gosh,
here.
those lawyers are going to stand up and represent 40,000 individuals this year. It's staggering.
Again, everything from driving with a suspended license to a murder.
To capital murder cases.
capital murder cases.
And the work we do is important, and it needs to be done well, and it is absolutely at the heart of the integrity of the entire criminal
And
justice
what is your
system.
budget, give or take?
About 10 million.
10 million. What is your budget for the penal firm, give or take?
Around 60 million.
So, I mean, we talk about taxes a lot on the show. We talk about money, but sometimes we don't get into the detail. We talk about how much money we spend on schools, and then there's everything else. So, okay, that's
Well,
interesting.
and those amounts are important, but do you know how much we spend to staff and run the jail? It's over $100 million
It's over
a
100
year.
million.
for the
No, downtown.
For the Shelby
for the
County
downtown
jail.
jail.
And that's what our local taxpayers are paying. And
So
that's
the
the
Right. 60
result of
million
an
was just
overburdened.
your facility,
Correction
penal firm,
center.
another 100 million downtown.
That's right.
Yeah, wow,
So-
that's amazing. Just a couple minutes left, Bill.
All right, and as I understand General Holder's message, he also talked about some kind of funding to beef up public defender offices across the country. It's still preliminary at this point, but are you looking for some kind of federal funding that might assist with your office?
I think federal funding is a goal that everyone doing public defense shares. When the right to counsel was mandated, an unfunded federal mandate on the states following a Supreme Court decision 50 years ago this year, there was no money behind it. And until the feds step in to do their fair share, public defense is going to continue to be incredibly challenged all over the country.
But with the sequester, they've cut they've cut
That's on
public
the federal
defenders
side.
on the federal side.
Right.
But just again, we're talking about that federal pool of dollars. It is far from unlimited these days. And again, I think public defender's office and the federal side here in West Tennessee cut people
They did.
in this
did.
year. So I don't suppose you're holding your breath for federal money. at
I'm
this
not
point.
holding my breath for federal money, but if I was king, the feds would pay for half of the cost
Yeah.
of public defense, and the states would bear the other half. I hope.
Let me
Someday.
let me ask you a question. And I said this last week to Amy Wyrick, and they stared at me blankly. But part of what I took from what they were saying, and even what you're saying, is that jail in and of itself, spending time in your facility, is not enough of a deterrent for some people. And as I pointed out, it is a deterrent for me. I do not mean to say otherwise, but it's an interesting thing to listen to you all and realize that going to your place for a year or two that's not enough of a deterrent.
Our society has changed. I mean, when you really think about punishment, there are basically three elements of punishment: separation from family and friends, restriction of movement, and the stigma of the institution. Now, if we look at all three of those, separation from family and friends, well, with the economic group that we have in jail, that's all friends. So I'm not really losing the connection. Stephen has a set of twins we talk about quite often. Taking Stephen away from that family, that's punishment. For a lot of guys and ladies, coming to jail is family.
Yeah.
You know, restriction of movement. Well, most people, and Memphis is one of those areas that people here don't get out that much. So the restriction of movement, where for you and I would be a major thing, you know, 110 acres that I can move around somewhere in there is not that bad.
Yeah.
And the stigma.
Go ahead.
You know, right now the most known address in Shelby County is 201 Poplar.
Yeah.
You say that, everybody knows. When you say the penal farm, everybody knows. So the stigma, you know, hustle and flow. We have glamorized going to jail. So for a lot of inner city kids, a lot of minorities, going to jail doesn't have that impact that it once did. That stigma is no longer there. You been to jail? Yeah, I was in jail last week. You see Bubba?
Yeah, yeah. And do you see, just 15 seconds left, you see that too?
Yeah, deterrence is something people love to talk about a lot, and it sounds good. The research on it, deterrence isn't, very few people who are committing criminal behavior are thinking about getting caught when they do it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to leave it there, cut you off. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Thank
Good
you.
night.